In order to understand team decision-making, we need to understand how an individual decision can affect teams. In this section, we will discuss the framing bias, the overconfidence bias, and the confirmation bias. By rewording a decision to seem like a gain or loss, the individual decision can be influenced toward whichever is framed. In a famous experiment, participants found the certain death of 400 people to be less acceptable than the 2 in 3 chance that 600 people will die. The second choice is riskier, but it is framed as a greater gain. Sometimes teams can avoid this, but there are cases where teams are just as prone to framing as individuals. The overconfidence bias gives individuals an inability to clearly see the weaknesses of a group, or the strengths and weaknesses of a competing group. This happens because the individuals exaggerate the strengths of their teammates, resulting in overconfidence of abilities. When an individual begins to take a project personally, the confirmation bias is stronger. Even when presented with facts disproving their belief, individuals will maintain and sometimes increase the validity of their claim. As a team, this can be devastating when receiving data that can result in the redesign of a project that has gone in a wrong direction.
There are 5 main team decision-making pitfalls that we will discuss. Groupthink is the tendency of decision-making groups to suppress dissent in interest of group harmony, following lead group members to overestimate their group's might and right. Escalation of commitments is the tendency to invest additional resources in an apparently losing proposition, influenced by effort, money, and time already invested. The Abilene paradox is a paradox in which the limits of a particular situation force a group of people to act in a way that can be different than their actual preferences, in order to avoid conflict and reach consensus at all costs. Group polarization is the idea that group discussion tends to intensify the group's opinion. Unethical decision-making is the idea that groups tend to lie more than individuals if it is profitable for them to do so. There are 3 main symptoms of groupthink. Overestimation of the group is when members of the group regard themselves as invulnerable and, at the same time, morally correct. This can lead decision-makers to believe they are exempt from standards. Closed-mindedness is when members of the group engage in collective rationalization by stereotyping out-group members. Teams that develop norms of open-mindedness create more knowledge. A pressure toward conformity is when there is a strong intolerance in a groupthink situation for diversity of opinion. This leads group members to suppress their beliefs. Now we will discuss ways to avoid groupthink. Monitor team size. Larger teams are more likely to fall victim to groupthink. Teams with more than 10 members may feel less personal responsibility for team outcomes. Provide a face-saving mechanism for teams. Often, face-saving concerns prevent people from changing course, even when the current course is clearly doubtful. Teams that are given an excuse for poor performance before knowing the outcome of their decision are less likely to succumb to groupthink than teams that do not have an excuse. The risk technique. This liberates members to talk about their doubts. Structured discussion situations can reduce group members' fears about decision-making. Invite different perspectives. In this technique, team members assume the perspectives of others with a stake in the decision. The key point of adopting different perspectives is to create a mechanism that will instigate thinking more carefully about problems, which could prompt these groups to reconsider evidence. Appoint a devil's advocate. Some teams institute a special devil's advocate responsibility to members of the team. Teams that anticipate having to refute counterarguments are less likely to engage in confirmatory information processing as compared to teams that anticipate having to give reasons for their decisions. Structured decision principles. The goal of structured discussion principles is to delay solution selection and to increase problem-solving phase. This prevents premature closure on a solution and extends problem analysis and evaluation. Establish procedures for protecting alternative viewpoints. Team members must convince others about the correctness of their views. For this reason, it can be useful to instruct members to record all alternatives suggested during each meeting. Second solution. This technique requires teams to identify a second solution or decision recommendation as an alternative to their first choice. This enhances the problem-solving and idea generation phases. Beware of time pressure. Time pressure acts as a stressor on teams, and stress impairs the effectiveness of team decision-making. Escalation of commitment means to keep putting effort towards something despite it being the wise decision to do it otherwise. There are 4 key processes involved in the escalation of commitment cycle. They are project-related determinants. Upon receiving negative feedback, team members ask whether the perceived setback is permanent or temporary. Psychological determinants. In some cases, people may choose to stay in a project out of fear of ruining their reputation or hurting their ego. Social determinants. In groups in which the members are familiar with each other, the probability of escalation of commitment is much higher than if the members are unacquainted. Structural determinants. A project can become removed from critical evaluation and can make it impossible for teams to consider ending the project. There are ways to avoid the escalation of commitment. They are: set limits. Figure out criteria and performance standards that justify continued investment. Avoid the bystander effect. Make sure everyone in the project knows what is going on. Avoid tunnel vision. Get several perspectives on the situation. Recognize sunk costs. Examine if the resources, such as money and time, previously invested can be recovered. Avoid bad mood. Unpleasant emotional states lead to poor decisions being made. External review. Remove the original decisions that may be biased. Now we will move on to the Abilene paradox. With the Abilene paradox, poor decision-making skills can lead to a decision that nobody wanted. This can happen with the presence of someone with experience. When team members believe one person has more experience than the others, they tend to go along with their beliefs. The presentation of a compelling argument. When the decision is made after a pointless discussion, no argument is made. A lack of confidence in one's ability to contribute. If someone feels self-doubt, they won't contest the decision made. An unimportant or meaningless decision. Unless the decision is of vital significance, some members will develop a who cares attitude. Pressure to conform. Members may feel pressured to go along with the group decision. A dysfunctional decision-making climate. People get unorganized and make hasty decisions. There are ways to avoid the Abilene paradox. Confront the issue in a team setting. Get everyone together and be straightforward and open-minded. Conduct a private note. Get everyone to write their opinions about the decision on a note card and ensure anonymity. Minimize status differences. Meet for discussion with status symbols eliminated, i.e. status, meeting place, and title. Utilize the scientific method. Using the scientific method, they can make a decision based on evidence instead of their own beliefs. Provide a formal forum for controversial views. Members should be encouraged to debate the pros and cons of the issue at hand. Take responsibility for failure. Teams and team members should not fear making mistakes, but own up to them and learn from them. Group polarization is the idea that group discussion tends to intensify the group's opinion. Because of this, the group may produce opinions that are more extreme than the individual's opinions separately. Risky shift occurs when team members become either more supportive or more against the issue at hand. A cautious shift occurs when people are already cautious of a certain outcome, and thus the group tends to be more cautious as a whole. There are two psychological explanations for group polarization: the need to be right and the need to be liked. Now we will discuss unethical decision-making. With unethical decision-making, groups tend to lie more than individuals if it is profitable for them to do so. There are two situational triggers for unethical decision-making. The rational expectations model describes the fact that people are motivated to further what is in their best interest, which may not line up with the team's or the customer's best interest. Pluralistic ignorance is defined as the belief that everyone else knows or believes something that we don't. Other members may believe that everyone else in the group is being unethical, and that makes it easier for them to be unethical also. There are several ways of avoiding unethical decision-making. When team members know that they will be held accountable for their own behavior, they tend to act more ethically because they believe there will be negative consequences if they don't. Teams should use a reward model that rewards and promotes ethical behavior and discourages unethical practices. Teams should also have leaders that act as good role models for ethical behavior. When the leader of a team is ethical, the other team members tend to be more ethical as well. Teams should also eliminate conflicts of interest. The interest of the team or its individual team members should not be at odds with the needs of the customers or the organization. Teams need to create cultures of integrity. Teams can do this by creating a cultural code to guide behavior. The cultural code should reward good behavior and discipline bad behavior. Let's review all that we have discussed. For individual decision-making, we discussed the framing bias, which is the idea that how you word or frame a question can determine how some people will answer it. The overconfidence bias, which is the tendency for people to overestimate their confidence in their judgments, and the confirmation bias, which is the tendency for people to look for evidence that only supports their belief and overlook the information that disproves it. For team decision-making, we discussed groupthink, which is the tendency of decision-making groups to suppress dissent in interest of group harmony, following lead group members to overestimate their group's might and right. The escalation of commitment, which is the tendency to invest additional resources in an apparently losing proposition, influenced by effort, money, and time already invested. The Abilene paradox, which is the paradox in which the limits of a particular situation force a group of people to act in a way that can be different than their actual preferences in order to avoid conflict and reach consensus at all costs. Group polarization, which is the idea that group discussion tends to intensify the group's opinion. And unethical decision-making, which is the idea that groups tend to lie more than individuals if it is profitable for them to do so.